Yali Madad and Eid Mubarak to everyone. My name is Shafat, and on behalf of the IIS Alumni European Chapter Group, thank you all for joining us. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Shenila Khoja-Moolji, who will be talking about her latest book, Rebuilding Community, Displaced Women and the Making of a Shia Ismaili Muslim Sociality. Dr. Shenila Khoja-Moolji is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Associate Professor of Muslim Societies at the Georgetown University. She researches and writes about the interplay of gender, race, religion, and power in relation to Muslim populations in South Asia and in the North American diaspora. Professor Khoja-Moolji is the author of award-winning books such as Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, The Production of Desirable Subjects in Muslim South Asia and Sovereign Attachments, Masculinity, Muslimness, and Effective Politics in Pakistan. She is also a member of National ITRAB in the US and in Al-Waiza. With that note, I would now like to welcome Professor Khoja-Moolji to take over and talk about her book.
Thank you so much, Shafat. I wanted to begin by thanking the IIS European chapter for inviting me. I was mentioning to Shafat that this is my first book talk. I've presented the chapters in various university settings, but I'm really excited to be able to do a book talk with the Ismailis. So thank you for the invitation. I also see a lot of my mentors and teachers here, so it's important for me to pay my respects first. Of course, I see my mom and my husband here. This book wouldn't have happened without their support. I see Professor Mita, Professor Kasam, Professor Shenil Jiva here, Noreen Ali's here, who supported with the magazines. And so I'm so excited that you were able to make it here. And thank you for all your support in bringing this book to fruition. I will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we can have Q&A. I also wanted to note that this presentation assumes an Ismaili audience, and so I don't describe who Ismailis are or translate Ginans or Pat, for example. I have a public talk coming up on Tuesday, which is for a broader audience. Okay, so let me begin by sharing my screen. This project is personal because it was inspired by my grandmother. In 1971, Nani, along with my mother, who was 12 years old at the time, had to flee East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, due to a civil war. Nani was already a widow at the time, caring for 5 young children while working at a restaurant. The war, as can be expected, jolted this family, which was always already on the cusp of poverty. But when Nani and her family landed in Karachi, the Jamat formed a web of care around them. They were first taken to a refugee camp at the Garden East Jamaat Khana, where they were given clothing and food. Hot meals, 3 hot meals, as my mom emphasizes to me. An ad hoc volunteer committee composed of displaced Jamati members themselves had come together to help other displaced families. Members of the committee helped Nani find housing and subsidized the family's rent for over a year. The image that you see here is of the building where Nani and her family lived. 6 people in a studio apartment. I took this image in 2019 as I was conducting field work with the apartment's current occupants, Ismaili refugees from Afghanistan this time, also being supported by the Jamaat. The volunteers helped enroll my mother in an Ismaili-run boarding school and provided tuition fees for several months. In this photo, you see my mother at the back in the white hairband, along with other Ismaili girls who were asked to stay back and attend summer school to learn the Urdu language. In the meantime, an Ismaili woman helped my Nani find work as a housekeeper for another woman. The lives of displaced working-class women like my Nani, a widow with 5 children, engaged in the informal economy, working as a domestic aide, always on the brink of falling deeper into poverty, are often not recorded within national or even religious histories. Also excluded from our histories is the labor of everyday Ismaili women who supported displaced Jamati members. It is not that these women are forgotten. They are indeed remembered and celebrated by family members. I remember them, you remember them, but they have not yet entered the official historical record of Ismailis. It was this potential loss of women's history and recognizing that these women's lives and community building effort would disappear unrecorded and unarchived that motivated me to write this book. By looking at women's history, we're able to expand our understanding of Ismaili religious and social life worlds. We are able to give ourselves an expansive sense of the past, which will inevitably inform how we imagine our present and the future. In the book, I draw on 95 oral history interviews with Ismaili women and men, 75 women and 20 men, who fled either East Pakistan or East Africa in the 1970s. This cohort of women are Khoja women who traced their ancestor to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor in India. In the late 19th century, epidemics and famines hit this region fairly hard and significantly weakened the community's economic prospects. As we know, the Imam advised the Jamat to head to other parts of India and to East Africa. This mobility and movement was made easier as new railways were established within India and increased commercial activity in the Indian Ocean afforded greater opportunities for Ismaili traders. So we saw a greater number of Khojas headed to urban cities in India and to the Gulf and Swahili coast. Later, during the 1940s and 50s, some Khoja Ismailis, like my Nani's family, relocated again to escape the violence that accompanied the partition of India. They headed to East Pakistan. So by the 1970s, we have a sizable number of Ismailis in East Pakistan and East Africa. Unfortunately, they now had to move again due to civil war between the East and West wings of Pakistan and Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians from Uganda, as well as anti-Asian sentiments in other parts of East Africa. These Ismailis now made their way to West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada in particular. In my book, I interviewed women who belonged to this displaced cohort. I asked them about their lives and the memories they have of their parents and grandparents to understand the broader role that women have played in maintaining the Jamat across generations and across continents. Studies about refugee placemaking often focus on how refugees transform their built environments, particularly public spaces, so that it reflects their needs and aspirations. Viewed from this lens, diasporic Ismailis have carved their place along migratory routes by establishing Jamat khanas and social welfare institutions. I extend the concept of placemaking beyond the construction of physical infrastructure to include the ordinary acts of care that sustain connection among people and to ideas. These include cooking for congregants, cleaning the Jamat khanas, packing a lunch for a traveler, helping a family find housing, telling Mojiza stories to pass on spiritual knowledge, compiling cookbooks to pass on heritage recipes, and writing novels to conjure a lost history. Placemaking in this more capacious sense can account for how religious communities are made in the here and now, as well as symbolically. This deep look into women's practices also gives us an understanding of how they practice their religion in the everyday. In addition to prayers, which are often the focus of studies on Muslim piety, we encounter women enacting their faith through mundane reproductive activities. These are care activities through which they not only express their faith, but also try to work out what their faith actually is. Placemaking after displacement then becomes a scenario for me to theorize in Ismaili ethics of care. Let me now give you a sense of the broad arc of the book, and then I'll share a few specific examples. After introducing the book, in the second chapter, I traced the childhoods of the women I interviewed and their memories of their foremothers to reconstruct their lives and forced migration. This older story of Ismaili migrations is often told from the perspective of empire, celebrating Ismaili men who thrived in the colonial political economy. I instead home in on women's everyday lives to show how they reinforced communal affinities while cultivating ethical sensibilities. How Mitibai Premji of Mombasa and Taj Bibi Abu Ali Aziz of Dar es Salaam took in boarders from smaller towns so they could attend school. How Sher Banu Lalani kept one double for the sown and one for household expenditures so that the sown money doesn't get mixed up with money available to buy soap. And how Ismaili women grapples with the firmans of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah when he asked them to drop this face veil. I then move on to accounts of how Ismailis fled East Pakistan and East Africa. These include traumatic experiences, from witnessing killings while fleeing under the cover of night to surviving on ketchup packet for days. But women also remembered the generosity of strangers and coreligionists. I have captured some of these episodes in the book so that my readers can understand how the effort of community building that we will see in the later chapters flows besides these stories of trauma and hardship. In this image, you see Umida Switlo with the bag that she carried when she left Uganda alone as a teenager. Chapter 3 examines women's efforts to create and sustain Jamaat Khanas across generations, first in East Africa and then in North America. It introduces Gulzar Qasim and Roshan Pirani, who created makeshift Jamaat Khanas at their apartments in Atlanta and Fort Wayne. In addition to the material practices of laying down chadars so Jamaat can sit on the floor, or trimming the legs of a coffee table to make it resemble a pat, placemaking included reciting dua, burning incense, and sharing food. Ismailis conjured the sacred sensorium of the Jamaat Khana during flight as well, on steamboats and at refugee camps, by reciting ginans, participating in wise classes, and celebrating kushalis. In fact, on one of these journeys from Chittagong, Kamaluddin missionary was the one who held wise classes while the steamboat was fleeing Chittagong. The chapters explore how Ismailis approach seva or khidmat and how we might think about some of its gendered dimensions. Chapter 4 outlines community making through Mu'jiza stories. I include stories of miraculous rescues as Ismailis were trapped in Jamaat Khanas, as well as stories of unexpected aid from strangers during the early years of resettlement. These stories reinforce faith in God's and Imam's protective care. Their retelling not only memorializes a shared past, but also shapes the future spiritual state of the Jamaat. In chapter 5, I examine cookbooks written by 3 displaced Ismaili women from East Africa, through which they introduce readers to histories of community life in India and in East Africa. They pass on heritage food practices and even share the Imam's advice on nutrition. Chapter 6 explores community making in the second generation, the daughters of my primary interlocutors, as they now engage with communal pasts, simultaneously interrogating and celebrating a shared history in novels, artwork, and dissertations. Having grown up in North America, this generation articulates an Ismaili ethics of care that intersects with locally manifest concerns around anti-Black and anti-Brown racism, and engages in a critique of settler colonialism and the model minority paradigm. They extend religious symbols such as seva to speak to their changing circumstances, including deterritorialization, not as that experienced by their mothers due to wars and poverty, but in response to the pressures of a neoliberal economy that requires workers to be mobile and flexible. Women of the second generation thus invent new sites and forms for producing spiritual intimacies, showing us again that Jamat is a contingent social formation that is remade by each generation. Overall, then, in the book, I draw on a specific cohort of Ismaili women and their ordinary practices of care in the context of displacement to tell a broader narrative about religious ethics and spiritualized socialities. I will now take you through some pages of the book so you have a flavor of it. In the late 1960s, as anti-Asian sentiments were on the rise in Tanzania, Gulzar Qasim saw her chances of progressing in her career as a gynecologist diminish rapidly. She therefore considered leaving. With a couple of other Ismaili women doctors, she decided to take a test that could lead to medical residency in the United States. She passed and was accepted into a program at Emory University. In 1972, together with her husband, Bahadur Qasim, Gulzar made her way to Atlanta. Through a contact at the Emory Library, Gulzar connected with two other Ismailis in the area, and they decided to get together at Gulzar's place. Gulzar recalls in an interview with me, "We thought maybe we should meet every week, and maybe we should probably do dua together. And we all got excited about it, and we said fine. RK was a great cook, so she could cook, and I would be her helper. And then every weekend we would meet." While initially this gathering only included Gulzar's immediate family and a couple of other Ismailis, they were soon joined by another 4 students who had moved to Atlanta. Gulzar describes this first gathering or congregation of 12 people to me. We all said dua and tasbih, and then we would have our dinner. And mind you, we were not all very religious or anything. We have evolved a lot. But at least we knew about getting together and having food and doing, saying our prayers together. Here, Gulzar mobilizes a different meaning of being religious, one that conjoins performing prayers with commensality and community, positioning this practice of religion against understandings that might limit it to the domain of formal prayers or exclude social life from its ambit. Iqbal Paru, then a student at Georgia State University and a member of this small Jamaat, remembers looking forward to those gatherings as a chance to enjoy Indian food. Gulzar would cook biryani and samosa, so I would say, "I'm coming." And she even used to pack food for me to take home. So I always had food for the next day. It was the only good food that I got. They, Gulzar and Bahadur, really took me under their wings. As more Ismailis arrived from East Africa, the makeshift Jamaat Khana moved to another congregant's apartment, and Iqbal Paru and Gulzar Qasim were officially appointed as its Mukhi and Kamniani. In 1973, several refugees from Uganda joined this small congregation. The members wanted more for their Jamaat Khana, a larger space and daily services. The Jamaat Khana thus moved to another location, a house on Lisbon Street. That's the image that you see here. Gulzar recalls that while the request for daily morning and evening services came from the patriarchs of the Ugandan refugee families, it was their wives who actually did the work that kept the Jamaat Khana running. Quote, "One person would be in charge of cleanup and do everything. We vacuumed every time after Khane. They would vacuum. It was mainly done by women, like Memani and all that stuff. So that really created the environment that we were used to traditionally. And in fact, whoever came early did the agarbatti. We always had agarbatti. So we ran the Jamaat Khana as a very formal place, and the women basically kept it clean and went on with the traditions." Gulzar's recollection shows how the seemingly quotidian activities of preparing food offerings, vacuuming, cleaning, and burning agarbatti, just as they had in East Africa, evoked imaginings associated with the Jamaat Khana. As geographer Phil Hubbard has suggested, place emerges as a particular form of space through acts of naming, as well as through the distinctive activities and imaginings associated with those spaces. For the newly transplanted Ismailis in Atlanta, burning agarbatti was a sensory reminder of Jamat khanas in East Africa. It transformed a repurposed house or a storefront into a spiritual place. Thus, women's seemingly routine activities maintained spiritual connection and enabled a continuity of traditions, as Gulzar's words remind us. Many of my interlocutors described these everyday community building activities as seva. Seva is a Sanskrit word used to express devotion and service to a supreme deity with whom the devotee has a personal relationship. The term is used by contemporary Ismaili Muslims of South Asian descent to denote service to the Imam, as well as to individuals and institutions in the Ismaili community and beyond. When I asked J.A. about why she used the term seva to describe her work in the Safai Committee, she explained, seva is good works that are a form of prayer. Seva is streva. She then proceeded to explain this wordplay to me by reciting a verse from a Gnan in which the term streva, which means to worship, is used. Eji kahore jivatame kis karan aya ji, nakidi sahib jini streva ji. O man, if you did not worship the Lord, then say, why have you come? J.A. appears to understand seva as broadly equivalent to ethical conduct, which in turn is recognized as a form of worship because it's anchored in a consciousness of the Lord. But many Ismailis also understand seva as opportunities given by the Imam to elevate their souls. In doing so, they evince a mode of religiosity where good actions are directed not just by personal intentions or niyat, but also made possible by the Imam. We thus observe the limits of human intentionality as space is made for divine agency, which arrives via the Imam. Consider my interview with Khurshid Bhimani. Khurshid arrived in New York City from Tanzania in 1971. In the months that followed, she built a secure position for herself at her new job, helped fellow Ismailis obtain legal documentation, and organized outings to give members of the community a chance to get to know each other. Khurshid went on to serve on numerous Ismaili councils and institutions over the next several decades. During our meeting, she described her expansive and extensive work as seva. When I asked her about what seva has meant to her, she says, a blessing. She then mentions a farman from Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, in which he had said, when I am happy with somebody, I give seva. When I am happier, I give them more seva. Even though a believer's niyat is considered a defining element of seva, Khurshid's reference to this farman shows that she received the seva also as a favor from the Imam. Agency for pious action then does not rest solely with the individual, but emerges in a dynamic relationship with the Imam. Because seva is offered by the Imam, women tell me of moments when the Imam eased the difficulties they encountered during their volunteer work. At the time Gulzar was serving as Mukhiani in Atlanta, she was also a full-time hospital resident. She would rush to the Jamat Khana still in her work clothes to perform her duties with no time in between to rest, change, or eat. Another woman who also served as Mukhiani tells me of being so tired at the end of the day that she would, quote, fall onto a pile of clothes and sleep right there. But then she insisted that upon entering the Jamat Khana, her tiredness would just disappear. My interlocutors explained this transformation by using phrases such as the barakah of seva, or feeling Maula's hand on my shoulders, or feeling an invisible bubble around me. These phrases point to a metaphysical source intervening and guiding women through the difficulties of their seva. But not all women use the emic term seva to describe their care practices. One of the women I spoke with, Leila Datu, described her activities at a transit camp in Italy, such as looking after elderly Ismaili women or taking care of a baby whose mother had just passed away, by insisting that she undertook this work, quote, because we were Ismailis. I met Leila Datu 3 different times, and she never used the word seva to describe all of her care activities at the camp. So in Leila's case, we see how an ethos of care becomes lodged in subjectivity. She did not have to qualify or explain it. Indeed, as philosopher Anne-Marie Moll argues, in care, qualification does not precede practices, but forms a part of them. In that sense, Leila's care for fellow Ismailis was a means through which she simultaneously discovered, expressed, and practiced her Ismaili subjectivity. Ismaili moral codes in these instances become manifest through mundane care activities in the flow of everyday life, where qualification is not deemed crucial. Cleaning an elder's bedpan and looking after a baby become tasks that one does as a matter of religious identity anchored in an ethos of care. We helped each other. We were Ismailis, as Leila insisted. When I visited my nani in Karachi during summer vacations, she would make me bhel puri. 10-year-old me did not particularly like bhel puri because I was not allowed to have the tamarind and cilantro-based chutneys that usually go with it. But even at that age, I knew that there was something about cooking and eating with my grandmother that deserved to be respected. So when she told me to wash the potatoes, I washed. When it was time to measure and mix the buff-sliced onions, I mixed. I would say that her bhel puri was delicious, unparalleled, like nothing I could eat at home in Hyderabad. She would smile, not a full beaming smile, but a half-clouded coy one. She insisted, write it down, Beta. For Nani, cooking was an everyday practice. It's knowledge passed down orally. She did not have any formal schooling. Write it down was not something she could do, but asked of me so that you don't forget. Nani passed away as I was drafting this chapter in the spring of 2021. COVID travel restrictions meant I could not attend her funeral services. I ate bhel puri every day for months afterward. I wasn't actually planning to eat it. I just ate it every evening as if following a divine plan. Weeks later, as I rewrote this chapter, I could intellectualize my actions. Perhaps this was my way of mourning her. But my body did not await such intellection before plunging into action, before remembering her through bhel puri. Food, of course, is not only about nourishment. It tells us stories about where, how, and when it was created, and about the people who consumed it. Its modifications and fusions reveal diasporic encounters. It transfers memories of women past and their labor. In women's food practices, we can also glimpse how the mundane act of cooking can be a spiritual practice. My nani often said, I don't use dal mirchi in my food because Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah advised against it. My mother imbibed that lesson and does not use dal mirchi either. And so in this chapter, I consider women's cooking practices, and in particular, cookbooks written by Ismaili women to uncover the role that food plays in community making in the diaspora. Nurbanu Nimji was born in Kenya in 1934, shortly after her parents, like many other Ismaili Muslims, had migrated there from Gujarat. By 1974, however, her father and husband had lost their business to nationalization, and the family feared that Kenya might follow Idi Amin's example of expelling Asians. Nurbanu's family therefore made its way to Calgary to begin life anew. Not long after arriving, Nurbanu's husband was appointed as Mukhi of a newly established Jamat Khana, and so she became Mukhiani. In this capacity, Nurbanu facilitated the settlement of many newcomers from East Africa who continued to move to Calgary throughout the 1970s. In the newly arrived cohort were recently married Ismaili women who wanted to cook heritage food items for their young families and new Jamats, but could no longer turn to their own mothers for help as they did when living in the multi-generational homes of East Africa. They instead reached out to Nurbanu, their ma or Mukyani ma or mother in the context of the Jamat. Nurbanu's daughter, Khadija, recalls that a lot of them didn't know how to cook. So they, would ask my mom, can you teach us this? Can you teach us that? So my mom said to them, why don't you get a group of people together and then I can show you all at once and then you will all know. Nurbanu offered cooking classes to this and other cohorts of Ismaili women for 10 years before she self-published her first cookbook. Khadija recalls that decision as being intimately linked with Nurbanu's work as Mukyanima as well. She says, one of the girls told my mom, as a Mukyanima, you should make a book, and you should put all this into a book and it will be so handy for so many people. Nurbanu explains that she wrote the cookbook to ensure that the foodways of her people are not lost in Canada. She says, a dish prepared from a spicy touch is the mirror of a culinary history of a people. Nurbanu's effort to document the food history of Ismailis is similar to the work of other diasporic women who too wrote cookbooks to ensure the transmission and cohesion of their cultural and religious groups. Nurbanu's first volume, for instance, uses recipes to tell stories of where Ismailis have traveled and describes the specific tastes and textures that they have acquired in the course of those journeys. This volume also structures social occasions along with the dishes, revealing the social values that Nurbanu wishes her readers to maintain. For instance, she includes sample menus for a full meal for invited guests, a buffet dinner, and a tea party, signaling the expectation that readers would want to or should want to maintain traditions of hospitality and commensality even in the diaspora. These values become all the more significant because the early life of many displaced Ismailis in Canada was marked by hardships, as my oral histories show. Often men and women held multiple jobs, and even children had to work after school. Some struggled with transportation and lived far from the Jamat Khanas, and thus had limited contact with fellow Ismailis and family members. While Nurbanu's full meal for invited guests might sound aspirational in this context, involving extensive preparation and considerable expense, this aspiration is ultimately not about the number of people around the table, but about the bonds that sharing food can create among them. By teaching her readers how to cook biryani and siro using limited and different ingredients available in Calgary, Nurbanu hoped to introduce them to the means through which they could care for their families and Jamats in unfamiliar settings. Nurbanu went on to publish 3 more editions of A Spicy Touch. The 4th edition imagines a second or third generation Ismaili audience who has no food memories from India or East Africa. It includes images of not only prepared dishes like the previous editions, but also spices and lentils paired with detailed explanatory captions. Certain dishes are marked as gluten-free, and tips are included on how to speed up the cooking process. Khadija notes that while her mother was keen to reproduce the original flavors that would connect her to the meals prepared by her own mother, she also offered recipe modifications and anticipating readers with varying palates. Nurbanu explains, there is not a singular Ismaili cuisine. The food of the Ismaili people is as diverse as the countries and cultures where they live and practice their faith. In theorizing Ismaili cuisine as always in the making, Nurbanu introduces Ismailis now born in Canada to heritage foods while also encouraging the fusions, substitutions, and tactical replacements that are part of the Ismaili diasporic experience. I'm going to close with an excerpt from the Mojiza chapter. I've heard many Mojiza stories, and in the book, I note that by retelling these stories, Ismaili women and men participate in the religious formation of younger members of the Jamat. I met 88-year-old Shamsuddin in his first floor apartment in Karimabad, Karachi. He looked frail in his wheelchair and did not at first feel able to talk with me. But his caretaker insisted that I just sit in the corner and wait. He will open up eventually. And so I did. After some initial inquiries, which helped Shamsuddin establish that I was in fact related to his sister, he seemed more comfortable and warmed to the conversation. Shamsuddin spoke in short sentences, primarily in Urdu and Gujarati. I was all set to work through the oral history protocol I usually followed, asking questions about childhood and seeking information about the Ismaili community and then experiences of fleeing from East Pakistan. However, as soon as I mentioned interest in his life in Maiman Singh, Shamsuddin went straight to the trauma of 1971. It was a massacre, he said, and he began to weep. I was caught off guard by the sudden shift in mood, but followed his lead. In late 1971, as tensions between East and West Pakistani forces intensified, Shamsuddin decided it was time to flee. But he wanted first to sell his meager belongings so he would have some money to start over in Karachi. However, riots broke out in his neighborhood and he found himself trapped with a dozen other Ismailis. They decided it would be safer if they moved into the Jamat Khana rather than remain isolated in their homes. They camped in the Jamat Khana for 29 days, eating, sleeping, and praying together. They were so certain of their impending death that the Mukhi performed the final rites, Madan Kanchanta, for each person. We received Madan Kanchanta. None of us could speak during the ritual ceremony. The Mukhi was weeping and we were weeping. As one of the few men left behind, Shamsuddin was tasked with safety and security. He was to stand by the gates of the Jamat Khana and keep the rioters out. One day, some locals arrived at the entrance to warn him, "You are next." Shamsuddin remembers the Jamaat sheltering in fear that night. But nothing happened. The next morning, the men returned to report that they had in fact been prevented from attacking. "Your imam was holding a danda and guarding the gates of the Jamat Khana," they said. "Your imam was riding a white horse and circling the Jamat Khana." As Shamsuddin shared this episode, tears trickled down his deeply wrinkled cheeks. Then suddenly I saw his chest swell up like that of a young man's. He sat up straight in his battered wheelchair. In a loud voice that belied his frail frame, he announced the presence of the imam. "You see, he is standing in our midst. He is standing in our midst. He is standing in our midst." Shamsuddin repeated the refrain aloud, as if it were a declaration to people passing on the streets outside his building. As if decades later, he was finally revealing the secret details of an intimate meeting with the beloved. They ran away. Not a child was hurt. We all passed with ease. We went on the Shams steamer. It was the last steamer to leave Chittagong. I sensed that Shamsuddin wanted to say more, but twice he pushed away his wheelchair from me. "I have said too much already," he said, hinting again that this was a story he felt he needed to safeguard. For 10 minutes, we sat in silence as I ate the biscuits and slowly sipped the chai Shamsuddin's caretaker had brought me. Suddenly, Shamsuddin lifted up his tasbih and said, "Tasbih does not lie. He takes care of us like a mother takes care of a small child. This is the mu'jiza of my life." Shamsuddin pushed back his wheelchair one final time, wiping away his tears with a ragged, stained handkerchief. I knew that the interview was over. The Urdu term mojiza derives from a root meaning that which overwhelms or that which disables. In Muslim theological discourses, mojiza points to those occasions when God and saintly figures overpower. These stories gesture towards a larger order when the Imam ruptures the Zahir to save his murids. Shamsuddin thus affirms key Shia Ismaili beliefs related to Imama, namely the Imam's divinely designated appointment, his divinely inspired knowledge of both the apparent and hidden dimensions of reality, and his God-given sanctity, Valaya, which includes the belief that the Imam can intercede with God. Shamsuddin accordingly believes that the Imam can alter the situation of his followers in the material world through intercession with God. By storing this experience, Shamsuddin simultaneously seeks to make sense of a traumatic moment in his own life and recruit me, the listener, as a believer. When he shouts that tasbih does not lie, he gives me a lesson in daily spiritual life, that prayers are not left unanswered and that the Imam will always protect his murids. There is so much more I could say, and I hope that you will read the book. But I'll conclude by zooming out and commenting broadly on the contributions that I hope that this book makes. So in terms of the broader contribution, first, when the history of Ismailis is written, it's often from the perspective of the imams, the missionaries, or elite men. While these histories have accomplished the crucial task of clarifying the broad sequence of events defining Ismaili history, I add new dimensions to it through a partial reconstruction of Ismaili women's lives. Second, when women's placemaking activities are considered, they often take the form of reproductive tasks, such as cleaning, cooking, and washing. Even though such work is necessary for the propagation of society, it is frequently viewed as a property of women's biology, and it is therefore undervalued. Marxist feminists have regarded housework as a paradigmatic site for gendered exploitation and have sought to elevate its value by moving it into the realm of waged labor. I instead align with those feminist and religious studies scholars who refuse to reduce women's work to productivist logics. I mobilize a different logic altogether, viewing women's reproductive activities as producing relationality and sociability, repairing past trauma, functioning as a means of harnessing spirituality, and furnishing intergenerational continuity. The challenge for me then is to emphasize the salience of this work and those who undertake it, while also pointing out the circumstances and scenarios when it becomes a site of exploitation. Finally, the role of religion in migrant and refugee placemaking remains underexplored. In fact, in relation to Muslim refugees, Islam is often mobilized to further demonize them. I, however, show a different side of Islam, where Islam offers resources to women to not only find solace and comfort during a difficult time, but it is also a code of conduct that helps them to suture their lives and communities back together. In this respect, I also note that there is an ongoingness and ordinariness to women's ethical conduct that extends beyond current analyses of Muslim charity and religiosity that are dominated by the hegemonic paradigm of self-cultivation. Ismailis practice their deen both by working on themselves and by working intersubjectively to create community. Of course, such modes of religious intersubjectivity are not distinct to Ismailis. Muslims globally engage in ethical community making. But unlike other Muslim groups, within Ismailis, the Imam acts as a centripetal force that gives this community a distinct route to ethical action. Identifying an Ismaili ethics of care is not to argue that the community's particular understanding of spiritual obligation honed in the diaspora is wholly distinct from modes of care developed in other communities. It is rather a close examination of one manner of living a Muslim life in which members of other communities or scholars who study them may identify points of commonality as well as difference. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. I hope I am audible now.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for this incredible insight on your book and hosting this wonderful session for our European chapter group. And now let's keep our platform open for the questions. If we have any, please shoot. Yes, Noreen.
Hello, Dr. Moolji. It's really nice to, hear you speak about the book and the concept and your journey. And I really liked that you shared what inspired you personally as well, your grandma's example. I think that, and then the idea of, and, contributing women's, like Ismaili women's experiences in the larger field of migrant and refugee communities and their experiences. I think it's a very important initiative, and your work will pave the way for a lot of future work there. So congratulations. My question to you is twofold. The idea of moza and miracles, I find that quite fascinating. In your journey of researching for the book and writing the chapters, whatever a concept you had of miracles and moza, what was the journey like? Did it transform? Did it influence influence your current understanding? And secondly, you talked about trauma stories coming up in oral history interviews, of course, because you're talking about refugees. In terms of researching for the book and looking at the data, how did you make sure that you practice self-care as well when you're dealing with this kind of material? So those would be my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noreen. And I should begin by also thanking Noreen and Wafi Momin at the IIS Special Connections for being so generous with their time and for letting me study the materials at the IIS library, which is, your collection is such a treasure trove for scholars. So thank you for all your support with this book. Thank you for the questions. The Mojiza stories, I think that I want to say that almost everyone that I interviewed had some formation of a Mojiza story. So I write in the book around how, because I also interviewed men, the stories that men told me often included some aspect of safety or security, right? So men most of the times were asked to guard the Jamat Khana doors. When there were riots happening, they were the ones to be on the front lines. And so some of their stories gained greater circulation. But women told stories of more intimate encounters when a stranger would come and help them, when a sort of unexpected aid would arrive. And so they would use terms like angels or Maula's hand when they encountered these unexpected forms of intimate aid in their life. And so in the chapter, I talk about that sort of scenario of the Imam, the supernatural intervention by the Imam as one genre of miracle stories in the Jamaat. But I also bring in women's miracle stories into the genre because those stories don't actually gain a lot of circulation. They're more intimate, they're familial, they are personal, but I think by talking about them, we can also, they do the same religious formative work. And so I kind of bring those together. I think in terms of my own engagement with these stories, I thank you for that question because there were some stories that were told to me on the condition that I would not write about them. And so as you can imagine that this research is, of course, I'm writing an academic book, but Ismaili women would often also meet me as a younger Ismaili. They were very invested in my own spiritual growth, and they also wanted to pass on certain stories because they assumed that the book would be read about by next generation of Ismailis. And so They were very forthcoming, but then there were also stories that they would tell me and say, this is only for you. You cannot write about it. And so those were interesting encounters. Those are, of course, encounters that I will cherish. Those were moments where they felt the Imam's presence so intimately that they were willing to share with me, but not make those publics. And so some of the stories that appear in the book then are the ones that I had permission for to write. And I think it was important to capture some of that so that we can also consider this aspect of Ismaili community building, where through these stories, we are reiterating our belief in Imam's care and protection. In terms of the trauma stories, I would say it was hard, and I think some people were willing to talk about it, others were not, and because there's a way to write this story as well, right? There's a way that I could have actually written an entire chapter on trauma. I could have studied trauma theory. There is a lot of interesting work on intergenerational trauma and healing. But as a scholar, I made the decision not to move into trauma because in part, I'll be really frank, I did not want for the women to have to share some of those stories with me if they didn't want to. But also, I also didn't feel that I was emotionally ready for some of those stories. And so the stories that I did encounter, some of them were really difficult. I have included a few of them just so that my readers understand that those few years of fleeing, but also early settlement years for this particular displaced women's cohort was really hard. And the community making work that you see immediately in the other chapters, like they're forming Jamat khanas, they're cooking for other people while they themselves actually are not really well to do at the time, right? I mean, they're struggling economically, they don't have jobs. And so I wanted to at least give a sense that everything that you see in this decade and the chapters later flows besides the hardship that they're also experiencing. And of course, I don't want to flatten the differences. Not everybody in this cohort of 95 people experienced similar forms of constraints. But those for whom English was not their first language, they suffered a little bit more. And so I think there's variation there too, but I think maybe that's one of the reasons why there are some trauma stories, but there is not too much theorization around trauma in the book. But thank you for the questions, Noreen.
Thank you, Dr. Moolji.
Thank you
I
so
have
much.
a question.
Yes, Farial, please go ahead.
I have a comment
Yeah.
and a question. Thank you, Dr. Moolji, for an excellent presentation, very touching, and how you captured the lives of women. You know, history has generally been written by men and reflecting men's experiences. Here you've very well presented the women's experiences, and I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I'm sure I could relate to your book very well in terms of my experiences, but I'm sure many, many more women who I've talked to could relate to it too. So thank you. My question to you is, have you looked at the second generation who are now doing well, have done, have succeeded well in the American society? What are the major differences between the first generation and the second generation of women?
Thank you, Farrell Auntie. And I should also say that that Professor Farrell Ross Sharif has encouraged me throughout this process, and so I'm really grateful to her. But also, thank you for making time to attend today's talk. So the second generation question is very interesting. I have a chapter about it, but the sample for it is only 12 women. Because I was focusing on the 70 plus women of the primary cohort, I wanted to have some sense of how the community making practices are evolving, but that would require sort of another book. And so I have some findings in relation to a small cohort of 12 women almost all of them, and I talk about the methodology in that chapter. I interviewed the women I either knew about or my interlocutors' daughters, and they were from the Seva circles and Jamati institutions. And so they're not really a representative sample. All of them had master's degrees, 3 had PhDs. All of them had been on national councils or national boards. And so it wasn't a representative sample, but I talk about that as well. But some of the ways in which their practices of community making differed was in relation to additional sites for building community. So for example, a lot of them considered Jamat Khana as still a central space, but they were crafting new spaces to think and practice their Ismaili ethics. A lot of them are very active in the Black Lives Movement. And so the protest space is a space for them to think about what it means for them to be American and to be Ismaili. There are women, for example, who live really far from Jamat Khana. One of the women that I interviewed lived 6 hours away from Jamat Khana. And so she spoke about how through being active in her own neighborhood, she's striving to figure out what it means for her to practice community building. There are ways in which this cohort extends the symbol of seva as well. So for example, women would also note that the professional work that they do is also part of their seva. So one of the women who is a counselor for Somali Muslim teenagers who recent refugees from Somalia, she spoke about how this, even though this is paid work, it is seva. And so a lot of women are stretching the notion of seva to also incorporate their everyday lives where they're doing work that is inspired by their Ismaili ethics, but it might be paid work. And so using some of these terminologies to speak to their everyday lives. But I absolutely think that you're right. I think the second generation work deserves its own sort of attention. And I think it would be a fantastic sort of study to focus on that generation too. Thank you.
If there is time, I have another question.
Yes.
Can you describe your methodology, or is it presented in your book?
Yes. I have a section on methodology early on. So as I mentioned, I started off with my nani. And so I started off an oral history interview, interviewed her over multiple different settings and in multiple different times, then went to the cohort that had fled with her. So then she would introduce me to other women. And of course, my mom, who was 12 years old at the time, also remembered the other women who were part of that cohort. And so then I moved to the cohort of Ismaili women who came from East Pakistan. And then they were the ones who would introduce me to other women. So it was snowballing from that way. And so that's, and so I think I completely relied on women to make introductions. For East Pakistan as well, I started with a couple of women I knew already from my encounters living in the US. And then I would ask them to introduce me to other women. And so that's how I kind of reached about 65, 70 women through these introductions. In terms of oral histories, I followed the usual protocol, learning about their lives and their childhoods. But I did make modifications around, for example, when I talk about the 3 Ismaili women who wrote cookbooks, my protocol differed for them because then I was asking them mostly about food and the process of writing and how did they get the funds to publish the cookbooks, right? And so I had a general oral history interview protocol, but then I modified it also as I was speaking to people about particular aspects of their lives. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Farial. I think we have Kaleem Qasim as well, if you want to go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. that presentation and for hosting this. Yeah, it was just very moving. I guess it connects to my own family histories, and it was emotional actually listening to the presentation at many points. My question was about you talked about the language of seva and Ismaili sort of identity. We are Ismaili in talking about this sort of work that these women did. I'm curious about other terms. Did people use terms like service, volunteering, khidmat? Were there other terms that came up, and do you discuss that as well in the book?
Yes. So the term khidmat came up a little bit, and it was used in a way interchangeably. Seva and khidmat, people would move back and forth because some of the women who came via the East Pakistan route after having stayed in West Pakistan would use the term khidmat, but because they had been in the US for, I want to say decades, and the term seva is more prominent here, they have incorporated that sort of terminology in their language as well. And so some of the aunties I would speak with, they would start with one and then move into the other one. And so I talk a little bit about that, but khidmat was the term, of course, that was prominent in that cohort. Second generation used service. But what was interesting was also, I think they're clearly familiar with the term seva. And so some of them would then talk about how there are certain prominent understandings of seva in the community and how they are trying to work through that or expand it or apply it differently to their own selves. And so I think they have a sense of this term, the work that it does, and then now what are the ways in which they're incorporating it into their sort of contemporary milieu. And so that's a sort of different engagement with the term, and I talk about their use as well. Yes, thank you for that question. It was great.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one. And I was also wondering, that now that the generation is also migrating, and if you would see the current generation, would you see a comparison between the three generations, what challenges they might have faced and how different it would be, and what kind of traditional values that they are passing to the generations to come? Would you see a comparison maybe in the future, books to come?
So I think that I'll respond to that question by thinking back to my cookbooks question. So one of the critiques, as we can imagine, of this genre of work in terms of like cookbooks is that that women are passing on certain modes of performing femininity without uncritically. So I think this is the sort of critique that emerges when people study cookbooks. But in the cookbooks that we consider in the book, we will see that like Nurbanu Nimji's cookbook, she's very conscious about making sure that she's not simply passing on an imagined authentic heritage to the next generation. She posits a heritage that is in the making. So if you look at the way she transforms her food practice, how she makes space for gluten-free recipes, how she gives advice to readers around how do you make khichdi, for example, which is supposed to be a 1 hour long process, and like 3 minutes go by this thing and then you're done. I mean, it's a fantastic book. So I think that we can appreciate how women, and I'm just giving the example of cookbook, that women of this cohort want to pass on heritage, but at the same time, they're very generous too. This is not an imagined authentic heritage that they're passing. They also leave space for the next generation to make it their own. And I think, yeah, so I don't know if that responds to your question, but I think those are some of the ways we can see this sort of fluidity in their work and how the next generation might receive it and make it its own, and then we pass it on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think someone has written in the chat as well about one of the migrants being so generous that you would never leave their house without getting fed. And if we continue to read the chat, there's one more message from Natasha. I think it's a question about, did you encounter critics from the interlocutors about appointed seva opportunities in terms of unequal status in gender roles?
Yes, so there were times when at least a couple of women who were mukhianis on their own were appointed mukhianis, and then they were when the Jamat Khanas were small, would no longer be appointed in these positions. And so I write about one such instance where she did critique the fact that such opportunities were not available to them. But I also think by and large, women were also able to create these everyday opportunities. And so while institutional seva was one aspect of seva, when you read the book, you'll see it is, there's an entire universe of care and relationships that are really dense, that are very local, that are interpersonal. There's a woman who speaks about giving food to another woman who is having trouble. So I think they're like these minor everyday ways in which women have contributed to bolstering each other's lives, to expressing care. And so I think a lot of that comes through as well. So the critique is a little bit there, but yeah. So it's part of that universe.
Thank you
a
for
question.
answering. Yeah. Yes, Shafat, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is indeed a very interesting ethnography of Smiley community and Smiley women especially. My question is, you mentioned, your work shows that how faith is part of everyday practices, day-to-day life of these women, and there's a very blurred line between day-to-day work and faith practices. So why do you think institutions have never attempted to record or document these practices and life stories of these women?
I don't represent institutions, so I don't really have a sense, but I do know that there's an oral history project at the IIS, so there is an effort. I think if we step back and think about it broadly, though, in the sense of Ismaili history or the work in modern Ismaili history, I think for good reason, we've been focused on preserving extant texts, translating those texts so that we have a sense of history. So I think that effort has received more attention. But I think now we are able to also write more about contemporary modern Ismaili communities. And there are a number of interesting ethnographies, not only by just Ismaili authors or institutions, but I think non-Ismaili authors too, that are out there. And so I would imagine that maybe now is the time where we will pay more attention to some of these ordinary stories. But in the life of a community, I would imagine that it's important to have a strong historical record of imamat. And if the first few decades were focused on that, maybe now we can expand it.
Yeah. Thank you. I have another question if I can.
Yes.
So it's more about your methodology. So you mentioned some of these words like khidmat or seva, and some of these expressions might be very hard to capture. And I don't know, I just wanted to know more about the challenges you encountered in capturing those emotions or making your interviewees expand on these emotions, because sometimes you just run out of words. It's hard to explain, especially by the elder citizens of our Jamaat. So how did you manage that?
So how did I manage to understand some of the specific ideas that they were talking about, or?
So the sentiments attached with their practices of seva or khidmat.
Oh, okay. So I think one of the benefits, and I write about my positionality in the book as well. So this is my third book, right? And so I think that one of the benefits and one of the differences in this book and the other two and the future, the fourth one, is that I write from within the tradition. And so this is, I think, from a certain sort of perspective, I have an insider's lens. I understand when women speak about, so for example, when Shamsuddin uncle talked about Madan Kachanta, and he started to like, he started weeping. I understood what was happening and I started crying too. And so and it happened multiple times because like he didn't have to explain to me what Madan Ka Chanta is, what the importance of that chanta is. I wasn't taken aback by the fact that he would cry. Of course, if you are a 25-year-old man and your mukhi is giving you Madan Ka Chanta because you all anticipate that you're going to be dead the next morning. I mean, so I think partly the benefit of being an insider was that it was a space of shared sentiment. I was entering a space where I was entering a space also as a believer, right? And so if you recall the Mojiza chapter in which they speak about Imam's intervention, I was not a questioning person who would say, how can you talk about the Imam riding on a white horse? I absolutely believe he was there and he rode on a white horse, and that's why the rioters did not enter the Jamat Khana, right? So I think there's interesting literature. Amira Mittermeier, for example, she writes about how, or even Juliana Hammer, there's a group of Muslim women ethnographers who write about how there is a way for us to do scholarship by being companions and kin of the people we engage with, and as opposed to being the objective outside observer who gets to write about them. And I think for me, because these were my people that I was interviewing, I think it was a space of shared sentiments. I was able to write about them in a way I probably wouldn't have if I was interviewing a community that I didn't have a history with. And I think that's also probably why it was a very sort of generative experience for me too.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for humbly answering all the questions. And I would like to share my sincere gratitude towards the insights and your personal stories as well that you bring from this book. And we look forward to reading more such stories and more such work from you. So thank you for this incredible session, and thank you participants for joining us in this large number. We are very grateful as ECG team. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, Dad.